we're going to start the main portion of our meeting, and that is domestic violence in Washtenaw County. And it's going to be headed up by our illustrious Teresa Reed, who's been a wonderful partner here with Washtenaw County Democratic Party. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Teresa. Go ahead, Teresa.
Thanks, Loretta. And thanks to all of the panelists who came before. My God, we're so lucky to have this kind of representation and leadership. Feel grateful. So I'm Teresa Reed, and I'm co-chair of the Precinct Organizing Committee and my day job most of the time. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. This program is dedicated to Courtney Neely and all other victims of domestic violence in Washtenaw County and beyond. Courtney was an Ypsilanti woman killed by her former partner in a murder-suicide on July 17th, 2020. Their 4-month-old baby survived. Before we begin, I want to be clear, we won't be addressing the current controversy surrounding Safe House. That's a temporary problem that will be resolved with independent investigation. In contrast, domestic violence in America is a chronic problem of shocking magnitude. Domestic violence, defined, is physical, emotional, and psychological assault and intimidation that establishes coercive control over one's intimate partner. It's perpetrated almost exclusively by men against women. In the United States, more than 10 million adults, overwhelmingly women, experience domestic violence every year. In 2017, 1,527 women, I'm sorry, it's a little hard to read this, averaging more than 4 every day, were murdered by their domestic partners. In 2018, intimate partner violence accounted for 20% of all violent crime. In the decade from 2010 to 2019, 23% of all American killings were domestic homicides. Abusers' access to firearms increases the risk of death to abused women by 400%. 65% of all murder-suicides are perpetrated by intimate partners. 96% of murder-suicide victims are female. And a large majority of America's mass shootings are perpetrated by men with domestic violence histories and unlimited access to guns. Black women are at greater risk than white women. In the US, Black women overall are twice as likely as white women to be fatally shot by an intimate partner. Young Black women are almost 3 times more likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner than white women in the same age group. The impact of children living in a violent home is devastating, both physically and emotionally, and the effects can last a lifetime. Our representative, Debbie Dingle, can speak personally to that, as she often has. These effects are worse when abusive partners use the children to control victims, as they often do, threatening to kill, kidnap, or otherwise harm children if victims leave, and threatening to fight for sole custody, which astoundingly courts sometimes grant. Domestic violence is a grim reality in Washtenaw County, as it is in every other US jurisdiction. The purpose of today's panel is to educate WCDP members about the realities of domestic violence in Washtenaw County and what we as citizens and voters can do to seriously decrease incidents of domestic violence against our neighbors and friends and improve our protective response when they occur. We'll hear from expert practitioners working in all capacities to intervene in and prevent domestic violence. These people are my heroes, and I thank them for taking time to be with us today. Each of these speakers has a list of credentials longer than my arm. It'd take 2 hours just to read them. So please understand that my very brief introductions barely skim the surface of their expertise. The speakers and I finally have agreed that we want to give a comprehensive overview of this extremely complex problem. That means we'll briefly examine almost every aspect. It's a trade-off that'll be frustrating in some ways, and for some of you, it'll raise more questions than it answers. Please put those questions in chat and we'll get to as many as possible. But we hope our program will illuminate the many dimensions of this chronic American tragedy. So the first question is, who's affected by domestic violence in Washtenaw County? Marie Tanha is lead domestic violence prosecutor for Washtenaw County. Marie?
Good morning, and thank you so much, Teresa. Good morning, everyone. I'm just very briefly going to introduce myself because I would like to use the majority of this time and dedicate it to the very important topic. I want to thank you all and thank you so much, Teresa, specifically for highlighting this very important issue and very big problem we have in our society. My name is Marieh. I'm the lead domestic violence prosecutor for Washtenaw County, working at the prosecutor's office. I've been working as a prosecutor since 2015. And before that, I have a background in academia. I got my PhD and focused specifically on domestic violence, psychology, policy, and law program. So there's an easy way to answer the question, and then there's a longer answer. So the easy answer to the question is that it affects everyone. Absolutely anyone you could think of is or will be affected by domestic violence. There's two ways I look at answering that question. One is when I say everyone, I mean victims, survivors of domestic violence can and do look very different. They come from all backgrounds. They come from different ethnical backgrounds. They come in all different ages. They have different job status, career status. The relationships are of different length and of different status. So I know Teresa mentioned a statistic that quoted that Black women are more likely to be killed in situations of domestic violence. I'd like to also extend that to, in general, we see a lot of women of different cultures that are severely harmed or tend to not be able to get the protection they truly need and deserve because of cultural barriers, language barriers, but also how society looks at victims. One of the greatest misconceptions that I fight on a daily basis in my job is that there is this idea of what a victim or survivor of domestic violence is supposed to look like, act like, and how she or he is supposed to behave. There is no specific way that you're going to find a victim of domestic violence. I've had victims who have had their lives completely torn apart, and they're not sitting there crying. They're sitting there on the witness stand, very stoic, barely showing any emotion. There are many reasons for that. One of them is that's just how they've learned to survive, is not show any emotion. There are victims or survivors that have been on the witness stand and yelled and screamed at defense attorneys, yelled and screamed at me, yelled and screamed at judges. Again, that doesn't mean they're not victimized by their abuser. That's just how they have learned to survive. So unfortunately, there is this vision that a victim of domestic violence is supposed to be timid, that's supposed to be crying, not stand up for herself or himself, is supposed to be fearful. And unfortunately, that is something we struggle with, whether it's at the time of officer response, whether it is trying to convince a judge or a jury that this is a person who is at the end of their rope and doesn't have anywhere else to go. It's a real problem, having this assumption that survivors are supposed to look and act a certain way. Because the truth of it is there are victims and survivors I've dealt with who are leaving their husband, for example, after a 60-year marriage. And the reason they didn't leave is because they wanted to make sure their children were safe in the house, that everything was okay. And then they finally felt okay to leave. Two things that I've brought up in my discussions about who's affected about domestic violence is representation is so incredibly important. Representation meaning that you see people that look like you, that talk like you. I bring up an example of meeting with a woman who is here with her husband from Afghanistan. She doesn't speak the language. She has a child. She doesn't work outside the home. She doesn't have a car. So that has presented a huge challenge for us in working with her. I was fortunate enough because of my background, I speak Farsi. I was able to communicate with her. We still had an interpreter, of course, but I was able to communicate with her in a language she understood, and that makes a world of difference. And I can confidently say that is true for women of many ethnicities. When you see someone who looks like you and can understand you from a cultural aspect, it makes all the difference. Another important thing to consider is that we need resources. There are some women who are victims and survivors of domestic violence who have some resources to rely on. There are women who don't. And a lot of the time, the response you see when they're on a witness stand, when they're talking to you, is based on the things that they lack and they need help with. When I say everyone, I also mean that other people in the community are affected by domestic violence. And there are many people on here that are going to speak about the effects that domestic violence has on other parts of our community. But just to mention a few, domestic violence, of course, affects children. And by affecting children, we're affecting the schools, teachers, other children. School shootings, as Teresa mentioned, are linked to domestic violence issues on a frequent basis. Our police are affected. Police officers are killed in domestic violence situations. Their families are affected by what they see and hear and have to go through. Other people who are in need are affected. I can't tell you how many times we'll read in a police report they were investigating a situation, a crash or something else going on, and they were called out to a domestic violence situation gone bad. Jobs are affected, your coworkers, employers. There are many, many people in the community who are affected. Unfortunately, and I want to mention this because it's very important, the pandemic has just added fuel to this fire. We've been working hard. We're still working on pulling some numbers because it takes some time to make sure you have the right statistics. Something I was recently able to get a hold of is a study out of Columbia and Northwestern universities that mention studies done showing that on average, domestic violence has gone up by 12%. It has gone up by, and these are reports, 20% during working hours. For first-time calls in domestic related matters have gone up 16% and 23% during working hours. I had my office pull very, very rough data, so take this with a grain of salt, but just so we have a general idea of what we're looking at in Washtenaw County, and I was just able to get this from them, so it does need some fine-tuning, but to give you a rough idea, just taking the month of June and comparing June 2019, June 2020, and June 2021, reports of domestic violence in our county have gone up 25% since June of 2019 and 21% since June of 2020. And again, those are very rough numbers. And again, I can confidently say that it certainly isn't all the domestic violence that's actually out there. These are just reported cases. So please keep that in mind. That is extremely scary. In a situation where resources are already scarce, where women aren't getting the help they need, women as well as other survivors, now we're in a situation that things are just getting worse. And it's time to get very, very afraid of where this is going. Domestic violence has long-lasting effects. And while we can jump back economically, we can bounce back in a lot of ways, the violence is going to have a lasting effect on our community. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie. Just so everybody knows too, we do have the Q&A coming, so we'll be able to dig in a little bit more to all of these issues. A question that we often hear is, a misguided question that we often hear is, why don't the victims just leave? Nicole Beverly is going to speak to this first. She's a survivor of severe domestic violence and the founder of the Enough Initiative and the author of the memoir, Finding Nicole. Nicole, can you unmute yourself?
Good morning, everyone. You ready for me to jump in on that
Yeah.
difficult
All
question? I'm going to give a very Cliff's Notes version of the answer, because there are many, many reasons that victims end up not leaving or being able to leave abusive relationships successfully. And, you know, we're really trying to change the dialogue into not why did she stay or why did he stay, but why did the abuser abuse? And until we can totally turn around that dialogue, our society still continues to judge victims. So I think it's so important to educate and know and understand, if you haven't been a victim yourself, a lot of the obstacles that prevent victims from being able to leave these abusive relationships. Love, relationships with anyone start out typically loving and caring. People aren't going to be abusive on the first date, and many abusers and perpetrators are very manipulative and can be charming and suck you into these relationships. And before you know it, you're in love, but they've had that mask on. So you have this perception of this relationship can be wonderful, it can be loving, but once the mask falls off and the abuse begins to occur, you have that hope that with change, with this person's promises to go to counseling, to never hit you again, that they're going to change themselves, that you can get back to that loving relationship. So in the beginning, especially, love and care for that person, or not wanting to report them to police and affect their job. Those are all factors early on, especially when a victim realizes they're in an abusive relationship. Lack of financial support. We know that financial abuse is often a key component in domestic violence. Victims don't have jobs, or they're encouraged not to work by their abusers, so they're dependent. Abusers are in charge of all the finances and financial decisions. For example, when I left my abusive relationship, my abuser immediately withdrew all of our accounts, including our retirement funds and our children's college funds, our bank accounts. And he was able to even move his debt onto my credit card because he was an authorized user. So financial abuse, if you can't afford a place to live, if you can't clothe and feed your children, you're not going to feel safe leaving in this relationship. Lack of safe shelter, a place to go once you leave your abuser. When women leave their abuser and they realize they've lost power and control, the abuser is going to become much more violent, and women are at much higher risk of being harmed by this person. And if there's not safe shelter, and as we just heard, the numbers of domestic violence are rising, and domestic violence homicides are rising. So without a safe place, family member, or someplace to go, people cannot leave these relationships, or they'll become homeless. And domestic violence is one of, I think now we're at number 2 reasons women and children are homeless in our country. Isolation, lack of support, strategically created by the abuser. Victims don't have people to reach out to for help. They don't have places to go, friends, family who can support them because the abusers isolated them for so long. The society in general, as we've heard already, creating this shame and embarrassment and for victims. I had to stop reading comments on the news articles about my case because people were saying, how could she be so stupid? Why would she pick this person? Why didn't she just leave? And that is, we hear jokes about domestic violence in society all of the time that put victims down. And when you feel embarrassed and ashamed to ask for help because of the way society judges you, you're much less likely to leave a relationship successfully. Family, cultural beliefs, religious beliefs often keep victims in abusive relationships because they would have to stand up to family and culture and religion in order to leave. And the last one that I'm going to talk about today is fear. So I've already mentioned the risk of homicide is much higher when you first leave an abusive relationship. You'll have threats of stalking. We fear that if we call the police, our abuser won't be arrested, or they'll be arrested and be out the next day, angrier, and we have no place to go. So victims are stopping, even calling for help because of that fear. Fear that they're not going to be believed by anyone, because that often happens to victims of domestic violence. Fear of losing their children in family court. We're seeing countless victims of domestic violence lose custody of their children because they can't afford the same level of attorney that their abusers can in the court system. So, and of course, fear for their own lives, which in my case kept me in my relationship much longer than it should have, because I believed my ex-husband's threats that he was going to hunt me down, he was going to kill me if I left him. And that's another reason so many victims stay in abusive relationships.
Okay. Thanks, Nicole. In fact, as Nicole has laid out, just leaving isn't an option for the vast majority of women. And Lisa Larance, our next speaker, is a practitioner, scholar, and postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, whose research has been on how do women extricate themselves? What do they have to put in place in order to protect themselves and escape? Lisa, can you unmute?
Yes, thank you, Teresa. And to clarify, my research broadly looks at women's agency in navigating abusive relationships. So I can speak to, I will provide 2 examples of empirical research that colleagues and I have done. And I want to clarify also that when I'm speaking of survivors in this situation, it's self-identified cisgender heterosexual women in relationships with abusive cisgender heterosexual men. And the first example that I have is work that colleagues and I did at the University of Michigan, where we had we called for a national sample of people who had ended a long-term relationship through divorce. So it's a very specific call. And it was interesting to the research group that they were very surprised at how many of these relationships were defined by domestic violence. But as a practitioner who has implemented programming and met individually and in groups with survivors and people identified as perpetrators, I was not surprised. And we learned from these women that they leveraged a range of strategies over months or years to end a relationship in a way that makes sense to them. So I'd like to clarify here as well that I don't want to encourage a focus on either leaving or staying, because leaving, as Nicole pointed out, oftentimes is the most dangerous time for a woman in such a relationship, and oftentimes does not make sense to her in that moment. So if we, as outsiders to that relationship, which all of us would be, regardless of our experience, we really don't know what she needs. So supporting her in that process. So in that first research project that I mentioned, we learned that women, again, use a range of strategies. The first one being they are putting a plan in place that may last months or years, and it is oftentimes structured around the age of their children. Women with younger children, it's going to take them a longer time to put that plan in place as it makes sense to them. Many of these women explained that they maintained an illusion with an abusive partner that everything was just fine. So at family gatherings and conversation with parents, with close family friends, oh, sure, everything's great. All the while that they're putting plans in place to, again, sever the relationship in the way that made sense to them. They were also in that time seeking additional education and credentialing. So when they did leave, that they were able to get a job where they could take care of themselves and their kids. And many of the women also detailed how they performatively attended couples counseling, meaning that they would sign up and they would go to couples counseling to show him that they really cared or that they were really invested, all the while not at all being invested in the process, because they were doing it as a self-protective measure. And if we can think of that language, self-protective measures, it looks as different as the people who come into contact with us in our daily lives. We never really know who a survivor is, and we must support them in their right to self-determination. Women in this study also sought temporary refuge in a whole range of ways. In their own home, they would sleep in another bedroom, saying that they felt ill or they need to sleep with an unsettled child as a way to get away from an abusive partner. Go and stay with a friend to say they were taking care of her or a family member. Again, not upfront saying, I need to get away from this, but as a temporary measure to provide some self-protection and some space. Now, the second study I'd like to share with you is one that Susan Miller out of University of Delaware and I did to understand women's descriptions of how they were, why they were arrested and then court-ordered to anti-violence intervention. So why is this important when we're talking to survivors? As Marie and Nicole have already pointed out, survivors use a range of strategies to navigate the relationships, and violence is one of them. And just as Marie was saying when she opened this, is that survivors don't present in one way. And it can be very disarming when we see people present in a way that the media or friends or our socialization has not prepared us for, because there really isn't a real victim or a good victim. There are people surviving the best that they can to make sense of and move forward and keep themselves and their families safe. With this second research project, some of the highlights are that women described actions that resulted in their arrest in terms of defending themselves and their children. And another category that was actually the largest category out of these 208 women was what we referred to as asserting their dignity. They were part of coercively controlling relationships, as Teresa introduced our time here together, with coercive control not necessarily involving violence. So it's the maintenance of long-term relationship dominance and control. And after a period of time, these women started using violence, resorting to violence, because they felt that nothing else would work. And so on the outside, it looked like they were in a non-violent relationship. So we must see beyond the violence when we're looking at abusive relationships. And I would like to touch on fear, as it was so beautifully brought up by Nikki. The women that I often work with would not identify themselves as being in fear to an outsider. And again, that can divert our attention from what's really going on. I oftentimes use assessment questions around dread. What is it about being around this person that you dread? Do you dread that they would find out about you, or look at your odometer, or try to control, when the bill comes, or look at your phone? This gets to the essence of coercive control that's beyond that violent focus that all of us must have to truly understand what people are going through. And I would, in my last moment here, before we move on to all these other amazing speakers, is let people know that I'm engaged in a research study. I'm interviewing people who identify as survivors and their experience in the legal system in Washtenaw County, specifically with their abusive partners having been court-ordered to battering intervention. So please contact me if you would like to talk about that, and I can tell you more. Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I really appreciate your research, and I have a whole bunch of questions about it. So I hope we do have time towards the end of the conversation. Women, it's hard for women to get away, as we heard, and it can take it can be a very long process. Then the next question is, how does the system respond when a domestic violence call comes in? Like, what happens then? And we have to talk with us. I just lost my spot here. We have to talk with us, Derrick Jackson, who's the Director of Community Relations for the Washtenaw County Sheriff's Office, to help walk us through and understand what happens when a call comes in.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, and thanks for putting this together, such a very important conversation. I do want to just reference this before I get into the steps of what officers do out on the street, is really just to say, if an officer is called and by the time we get there, right, we're talking about someone has been victimized, someone has been harmed. And so, yes, we need to respond in the right way. Yes, officers can do things to help prevent future violence from happening and then hopefully prevent homicides from happening. But I just want to put this out to this conversation, is that we also need to be thinking about further upstream. Primarily, what are we teaching our young boys and young men about relationships and how they deal with their significant other? So I'm not the expert on that. I don't want to try to be the expert and go into that, but I just wanted to mention that, because when our officers are called, that means we're responding because something bad has happened to someone. And as I get into the specific steps that an officer takes, I also think it's important for us in our county to realize why we do the things we do as officers, or why our system functions once that call is made the way that it does. And it's important to know that this was it's not a policy or a practice that is solely based on, say, what law enforcement officials think. Someone like myself saying, well, this is what our officers should do, is really a co-produced policy that predates me. It was in place a while ago, but I will say that something pretty significant happened in last year where we instituted the lethality assessment, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the policy being designed by folks that are on this call, some of the attorneys, but also some survivors, and also folks who really know domestic violence work and what it looks like and what happens. much better than officers, but teamed up with officers, I think is really, really important. The other part about our county that I do think is important, I'm not sure if it's unique or not, but every community, every police agency signs on to the same domestic violence response policy and protocol. And that means that each officer should be doing the exact same things. Now, they may do it different because they're different individuals, and each agency may train just slightly a little bit different. But the steps in the process are the same, regardless of the officer you come in contact with in Washtenaw County. And to me, I wish that other things could be the same kind of response and the same policy across all agencies. So I think that's a really important piece. The other thing is, the goals that are even stated in the policy that officers, get trained on and then sign off on are the exact same goals of a safe house and of many people on this call, right? To protect victims, to increase reports of domestic violence so people feel okay to call the police and report it, to enhance the responses to victims, to hold offenders accountable, and to reduce future violence. So I think that's important to say because it sets the context for what we really do. And I know it's in the training, and Arianne's coming up, and I remember her voice in the training very clearly talking about a good response protocol is homicide prevention. And so officers, and I talk about this a lot as a social worker who became a police officer, that officers are often that front door to human services or supportive services. We don't often think about that, but in many cases, it's a police officer that gets called because something has happened, someone's been harmed, and they can be that first connection. So it is a very important role that officers play out on the street. So with all that being said, let me get to the response and specifically what officers do kind of step by step. So dispatch gets a call, and as soon as it's described as domestic violence or intimate partner harm in some way or an assault like that, dispatch takes it very serious and puts it out as an emergent issue. And I think that's important for people to know that when they hear domestic violence in our dispatch center, that means officers are being responded immediately for like a serious crime. And just to give more context, it's serious enough for us to have in our policies and training that 2 officers will respond. Sometimes one officer has to because of just where they are in proximity, but that should say to us, the people listening here, just how serious we take it in law enforcement in our community, that 2 officers are going to respond. And a lot of times that's some of the things I think Marieh mentioned. Some data you look at shows upwards of a quarter of all officer line of duty deaths happen when they're responding to a domestic violence situation. That's pretty significant, right? Like, so there's an officer safety piece to that officers take really, really serious. She already mentioned a large portion of like mass shootings have some tie to domestic relationships. And then, there's a large percentage of homicide suspects that have domestic violence in their history. So when you look at it, domestic violence is a very, very serious just community safety issue, not just the family or the individual who's directly being impacted. The second step to that after dispatch puts it out to officers is when an officer arrives, to separate and investigate is the easiest way to describe it. So you don't want to have the abuser standing in eye shot of the person that they just physically harmed. They have that control just by proximity in some cases. And so really separating and trying to investigate and identify what happens or what happened, I think is really, really important. I know that many people have been watching what's happened, the tragedy with Gabby Patino. And if you watch that video, there are some things that I'm looking at as an officer saying, wow, like sight sound, like get people away from one another. I think it was just the first thing that popped in my mind. So that's just an example of separate and investigate. The other is then doing the lethality assessment. So all officers have to do the lethality assessment and fill it out. It's a series of 12 questions. Others on this call know much more about the science behind it than I do, so I'll let them talk to that. But there are questions like, has he ever threatened to kill you or your kids? Do they have access to weapons? And you score that. And certain questions get a higher score, so to speak. And depending on how someone scores out on that, there are other steps now. And this just went into place in Washtenaw County in 2020 that go into action. So if someone scores out and it seems like it's a pretty lethal situation based on a lethality assessment, they automatically get referred to our detective bureau. What that signals to us is more sophisticated investigations, more time dedicated to it. It doesn't just go on a bookshelf somewhere and get, kind of get logged. So after that lethality assessment, it's also important to know that we have in our county a preferred arrest policy. Not everything is that way, right? We don't want to arrest everyone for every single crime, but when it comes to domestic violence, it says right in our policy, and we get trained to it, preferred arrest policy, meaning you can and you will and you should arrest someone. Doesn't mean everybody gets arrested in every domestic violence call we get sent out to, because the other thing about domestic violence, I think that is pretty important for us to know, is that sometimes it doesn't look like just very clear bruising, right? Malicious destruction of property, larceny, or someone breaks in your house, the abuser broke in your house and stole something. All of those things I think are really, really important. So it doesn't sometimes come to us as very clear, cut and dry domestic violence. Then there's a safe house notification. That's the 5th step in the process. So safe house does get notified by officers in all of these. Resources and safety. So after you have investigated, whether you've made an arrest or not, talking about what resources are for the victim, the survivor, and how to get to safety or where might be a safe place to go. So officers get trained in that. Making sure they get their statement of rights so that they understand what their rights are as a victim of domestic violence. And then the last two are, I think, really important. How we question and interact with someone. And this is where, of course, we need to get better and continue to get better. But I think that's an important piece, like how officers are being trained in interacting with individuals. Because again, if we're the front door in many cases, and we are responding in certain ways that are negative, that it's not a door they want to come through. And then the report must be done by the end of the police officer's shift. So it's not something that just sits in a queue. Some crimes that happens, it takes a while to finish a report, but these have to be done by the end of your shift. And then the last piece I just want to reiterate, it's so complex. It isn't just cut and dry sometimes. There are these other smaller level crimes that really tie back to domestic violence that sometimes aren't even called in as domestic violence, but they can show a pattern in practice that officers should be able to recognize through our training and things of that nature. So I know my time is short. I will end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have.
Great. Thank you so much, Derrick. I want to underline something that Marie and Derrick have both said. And, we often think of domestic violence as a private matter. It's between spouses. And you guys have both pointed out that it's totally not private. I mean, it spills out all over the culture in so many different ways, in children who can't perform in school, and children who are aggressive or depressed, and in domestic abusers out with guns killing other people. And it's not contained. It's not private. Even if it were private, that wouldn't be cool either. But it's also a public menace, not just a personal problem for some unfortunate women. So back to law enforcement. Law enforcement officer is in great danger when they reply to a domestic violence call. 25% of on-duty deaths are in responding to DV calls. That's amazing. And then sometimes we've heard and we know all officers inadvertently make the situation worse. And maybe not here, but in many places. So we want to talk about what is the required training for police officers who respond and who's responsible for providing the training. We have an amazing person to speak to us about this, Arianne Slay. She's currently Deputy City Attorney in Ann Arbor, and she's also a domestic violence trainer for the Prosecutors Association of Michigan. So Arianne, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are having a beautiful fall day and welcoming in Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Everyone wear your purple, wear it every day, wear it often. I have a very narrow role for you this morning, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what are requirements for police officers, and that starts at the academy. MCOLS, which is the governing body that allows police to be police in the state of Michigan, is the Michigan Commission on Law Enforcement Standards. You want to remember that MCOLS, as I'll call it later, because I will give you a call to action. So if you are a note-taking person, now is the time to grab a pen, because there are some things that are going to shock you and hopefully move you to do something after this meeting today. The police officers during their months at the academy have 14 hours of training related to domestic violence. 8 hours, which are called investigation and response, and it's not less than 8 hours. That's for the accredited academy. That teaches you where to park your car when you come to a domestic scene, where to conduct interviews, components of officer safety and scene safety, what to do if a little kid answers the door. I teach that at our local academy at Washtenaw and a couple other places around the state. Washtenaw does a little more than 8 hours. They do more than what is required, which is great. It's a step in the right direction. Not less than 3 hours of what is called nature and prevalence of domestic violence. That talks about the social emotional response. It talks about how to interview. It dispels myths around domestic violence and interpersonal violence. And finally, another 3 hours regarding the actual compiled laws. So the MCL 750s, somewhere in that penal code, we find crimes, and you're teaching each of the recruits what the crimes are and how to make a go of an investigation. Luckily, here in Washtenaw County, we have a bonus because our community college is committed to preparing our recruits and future law enforcement a little bit more. They're doing 7 additional hours related to homicide prevention and strangulation. And Marie could definitely tell you, as well as many other on this call, that the homicide prevention, if you prosecute strangulation cases appropriately and they are investigated appropriately by the police, you are doing something to the good towards homicide prevention. In addition to that, they are also taught in forfeiture by wrongdoing investigations. That's how to investigate a crime with the knowledge that a victim may be unwilling or unable to testify later. And an introduction to FETI, which is very important. That is a trauma-informed investigation technique. FETI trainings can range from 4 hours to 5 days, and they're absolutely invaluable. But as we know now, you get what you pay for in terms of training. So if you're willing to pay for half an hour, your officers will be a half an hour trained. Post-academy, so they all graduate, they take tests. Every year, there is a requirement for them to maintain their certification as a cop. They need to qualify with their firearm. That's it, folks. Not CPR, not de-escalation, not implicit bias. That is not there. But when you do see that at a police department, then we hats off to the chief and the administration, because any other training in and above that is to the credit of the department and the council or commission that is funding them. When you first get out to the police department that you're hired in with, you will likely have a field training officer or an FTO. That you will have an in-house academy where you might talk about domestic violence again, or you might not. Those range from 0 to 10 weeks. You might have a shadow phase where you're riding along with another officer. That ranges from 4 weeks to 4 months, or in some departments, 1 day. So we're not talking about a huge influx in additional training once the folks get out on the road. What we would love to see included in domestic violence training, because it's so integral and connected, is officer wellness. Going to domestic call after call leads to secondary trauma that is very real, and it is very organic. And seeing people harmed night after night is going to affect you. And sometimes the effects of those aren't seen until it's too late. Where do you put that information? Where do you put the visions that you can't erase from your head? How do you put that trauma in a way where you don't become fatigued and take it out on the next call, where you're disrespectful to a victim or a suspect? They'll lead to poor investigations, a mountain of effects. And I could talk about that for days, I'll tell you. The dangers of defunding, right? Training is the first thing to go when we're talking about defunding police. There's not enough to start with, as you can see. Wellness programs aren't going to be initiated. The officers are suffering, in turn, the people that they serve will suffer. And victims of intimate partner violence are really going to be the ones at the short end of the stick, yet again. And remember, our victims are the ones who never asked to be here. They didn't sign up for this. So we need to be cognizant of that when we are working in our criminal justice reforms. We need to remember that they're the ones who need to be consulted first, last, and often. And we haven't been doing that. So I will give you some call to action. The first one, our Crime Victims' Rights Act, which was originally authored in 1985, which is now in part of our Michigan Constitution, woo, needs to be amended. We need to protect victims and survivors during this age of YouTube court, which is how we are running our courtrooms, which is great and it's fantastic, but there are dangers that are associated with that for many of our survivors. We need to afford survivors the opportunity to be involved earlier in the process regarding parole notifications. 30 days notice that someone is getting out of prison is not enough. That there are safety issues and concerns. And we need to increase avenues of collection for restitution. If you feel inclined to write to MCOLs, the curriculum needs to be updated. It is very old. It does not include mandatory strangulation investigations, trauma-informed interviewing and communication, and it doesn't have much about officer wellness as it relates to intimate partner violence. If you are a local bird and you want to get working in your local community right here in Washtenaw County, make sure training is on the agenda at your local police department. And if it's not, contact your local police oversight commission to make sure that they are working on that issue. If you don't have a local oversight commission, start one. This is how we all work together. Oversight commissions are actually collaborative. And you as a community member working with our law enforcement, working with our local prosecutors, it makes a difference. And that's how we move forward. If you want institutional change, you need to be committed to being informed and providing that progressive training. I always say that if you are going to speak to the choir, make them sing when you leave. I hope you all sing. It is a huge role if anyone is interested. I know the city of Ann Arbor has our own ICPOC, the Independent Police Commission. So if you have concerns, woes, or accolades, please feel free to reach out to the ICPOC Commission on the City of Ann Arbor's webpage. Have a wonderful afternoon. I'll be around if you have any more questions, and I will drop in those calls for action into the chat for Ms. Teresa.
Oh, thank you so much. I was going to ask. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Arianne. So we all know that batterers are dangerous. And when a batterer is arrested, he's pissed off. And that's a point of great danger. So we're fortunate to have with us David O'Black, who's a probation agent for many years at the 15th Judicial District Court. Don't say that 5 times fast. And also James Henderson, who's a private consultant with Accountable Choices Domestic Violence Intervention Program to help us understand what happens after a batterer is arrested. David and James, welcome.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's a privilege to do so, and I appreciate it. What happens after a defendant is either found enter a guilty plea or a no contest plea or found guilty at trial, they're referred to probation, and they're referred to probation for an assessment, and then the judge will expect recommendations from probation as far as what to do from that point forward. The type of assessment that we do is called a pre-sentence interview. Those of you with a psychology background or social work will probably understand the phrase biopsychosocial. That's a very inclusive interview where you take a look at folks' history and their current circumstances, ask a lot of questions, listen for answers, ask probing questions based on the answers you're provided, and hopefully get a good overview of who this adult person is sitting across from you from the table, so that when you make recommendations, they're recommendations that are unique to that person that will have a positive effect if they choose to participate. We also, as much as humanly possible, try and speak with the reported victim in a case and get as much information from that person, so we can incorporate the information that we receive into the recommendations that we provide to the judge. The recommendations often include aspects that address substance abuse issues, mental health issues. Those are not excuses for engaging in domestic violence. There's plenty of people who are mentally ill and who are alcoholics and drug addicts who will be very symptomatic of their mental illness or get super drunk tonight or super high tonight who won't lay a finger on anybody. There's core issues involved in these cases for domestic violence offenses, and that's what we try to get at. The primary recommendation that we make is to what's now called a battering intervention program, also called a domestic violence program. We have excellent domestic violence programs in this community. And as a probation agent, most of the people that most of the agencies that I refer defendants to are part of this panel. So at this point, I'm going to turn over the rest of my time to Jim Henderson. And I think you'll understand why in just a moment. Jim?
Thank you very much, David. So good to be here. Also, Teresa and the panelists for allowing me to be here today. I appreciate it. It's really interesting when we talk about the whole area of domestic violence. There's an old saying that I heard when I was a little kid. If one person tells you you have a tail, you get to ignore them. If 5 people tell you, you better turn around and check. So when we're looking at men who use violence, they don't recognize that what they're doing is wrong. I may have grown up in a home where that's how my father treated my mother. That's how my brother treats his partner. That's what I see in the media. That's what I hear in music. And so we feel very titled, very privileged, very that we have all these justifications for my behavior. You know, she agitates me. She doesn't do this. I'm under stress at work. I have a drinking problem. And unless we figure out as a community how to send a consistent message that this behavior is problematic and will not be tolerated, we will continue to have domestic violence in our backyards. So when we talk about what needs to happen after arrest, all right, first of all, we need good 911 operators that when they're talking to a victim, we're not victim blaming. Are we even giving 911 operators training, or are they the forgotten people in the panel? Then are those 911 calls shared with the prosecutor, shared with probation? I'll tell you what, when I meet an offender as a probation officer, long after an arrest has happened, he has a nice haircut, he's sober, he's dressed as nice as Officer Oblak is, he's polite, gives me a firm handshake, the victim's cleaned up, everything's perfect. But when I go back and listen to a 911 call, I actually hear the terror in a victim's voice. I hear the children in the background screaming and crying. I hear a man that doesn't sound like Denzel Washington. He sounds like the spawn of Satan, right? It gives me a whole different feel. But we want these easy little assessment tools, these little checklists. We need to do a better job of looking at the evidence from a variety of areas and sharing that information with each other. Then we need police officers who know, and Washtenaw County has been excellent at this, where we separate an alleged perpetrator from an alleged victim and we ask appropriate questions. We look at predominant aggressor. But oftentimes the police officer only writes his report, quite honestly, for the prosecutor. He's looking at, do I have probable cause to do an arrest? Do I have the information? And he's trained how to write his police reports, often by the prosecutor. He doesn't look at putting this violence into context, where there's information that will be shared at the day of the incident that will be forever lost to the system if it's not collected and put in that report. And it will not help the prosecutor get a conviction on this guy this time, but it will absolutely change the trajectory for me as a probation officer to understand just how lethal or dangerous this guy is. He may have gotten a police call on him for slapping the victim in a parking lot. He may have gotten a police call because he was too noisy in the apartment next to him. But when we talk to the victim, we find out last week he held a gun to her head, or he had threatened to kill her if she left him. And all of these things that don't matter about today, but really put that in context. So making sure our police officers write a report thinking about all partners. Now let's say he's getting sentenced. Too often we have well-meaning judges who focus on the wrong thing. They focus on my drinking. They focus on my mental health. They focus on all these things that Jim does to cloud my behavior. First and foremost, what needs to happen is a judge needs to make sure that this is always about victim safety, right? And we were really lucky. When I worked in Ann Arbor, and I worked under the Honorable Judge Hines and Ann Matson, they were amazing women, right? They treated men with dignity and respect. We didn't try to abuse men and oppress them and mistreat them. But we absolutely made sure that when we're dealing with this case, Mr. George, it's about the safety of Mrs. George and George Jr., right? Your behavior has to change. And these are the opportunities I'm going to give you to create change. So you want a judge that does it. You want a prosecutor who, when they're standing up there and talking about the case, that they're relating what are the high risk factors that we're concerned about? Why does this judge need to take this case seriously? Why do we need longer term batterers intervention programs? Washtenaw County does a really great job on that. For the most part, really, our city, domestic violence was a crime in the city of Ann Arbor, I think 10 years before it was a crime in our state, right? Under a city ordinance. And the city prosecutor used to be the one that prosecuted those. That only changed when the state law changed, and then we wanted to make sure that it got into the NCIC so we could do criminal background checks, that it moved over to our county elected prosecutors. But So we've done a good job. We had a great, powerful shelter that was really active and said, hey, probation officers, you need to think about what you say and do and what you don't say. Always sends a message to the victim. And if she's going to participate in the future or not, it sends a message to the assailant if he finds a way to justify his behavior. So really working with, if I have great 911 operators sending a message to a victim, this is not your fault, we're here to support you. I have police officers and advocates who are meeting with that person and say, it's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about his choice to use violence, and he chose to do the behaviors that he did. And we send a message to him. It's not about what your partner did or didn't do or how frustrated you are or about this. It's about your choice to use violence. That was clearly on your menu of options, and we need to figure out why that's on your menu. Now, where we've made some good changes recently is trying to say that we're not just going to treat men like garbage, right? Like, you're a horrible batterer, you need to be locked up forever, you're an evil person. Many of these men have their own set of trauma. So if we can do a good job of just pulling us together as a team, I think we can have just a great outcome for families. And the earlier we can intervene, the better. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're gonna take a minute, several minutes, to talk about how we keep survivors and children safe during the process of arrest and processing, and in the courts, and then we're going to come back to the prevention points and battery intervention. So to talk with us about how we keep survivors and children safe after an arrest, after a report or arrest, is Marieh Tanha, again, our lead domestic violence prosecutor for Washtenaw County. Thanks, Marieh.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to everyone. You guys have done such an amazing job covering all of this. I'm going to just jump right into it because I know we're limited on time. So when a case comes in for charging and it's labeled with what we call a DV stamp, that's an indication, just as Derrick spoke about, how seriously a domestic violence case is taken by officers in the prosecutor's office. When something comes in with a DV stamp, it needs immediate attention. If the suspect is in custody, it should be reviewed within a few hours at most. If the suspect is not in custody, the goal is to review them within 24 hours. And a few points I wanted to talk to before I move on from the charging point of things is that's where it really matters to understand the domestic violence dynamic. It was mentioned that, and I think it was Jim who mentioned it, sometimes something will seem like such a minor issue, but really there's so much more behind it because of previous incidents that have not been reported. As an example, I had a case come in where a woman gets into an argument with her husband, kids are at home, he pushes her, she runs out to grabs the kids, runs out to the car with the phone, is calling 911, crying, saying, please get here, please get here. To an untrained eye, that may look like she's exaggerating, she's overreacting, or she's quote unquote crazy, which is what a lot of people want to call domestic violence survivors, because to them, if you're not educated on the matter and you don't understand it, it seems like it's blown out of proportion, right? It's a push. Why is she reacting this way? So when I see that as a prosecutor, if I know and I understand the dynamics of domestic violence, I'm not going to see that as just a push. I'm going to ask myself, what has this person done to her in the past that makes her fear what's about to come? And that's what I did. So, we contacted the officer in charge and we kind of worked through it. And it turns out it's been years of abuse. He's used weapons on her before. So to her, this push was just a warning. It's coming. It's about to hit. So she grabbed her kids, ran out and hid in the car, which at that point, if we know that, it's understandable, right? So when we present a case to a jury later down the road, and I can present a full picture of what's going on, that is more understandable to most people than he pushed her, she ran out and called police and took the kids with her. So something I like to do as often as I possibly can is talk to a survivor early on. So when something comes in, especially if it's a high lethality case, I either have my victim advocate reach out to them. I do so myself. Frequently, we do it together because the victim advocates in our office are trained on speaking to victims, of course. But it's also important that victims hear from me because I'm ultimately the person who's responsible for telling their story in court. And the question I like to ask them is, what would help you in this situation? not what do you want to see happen to him, not, why didn't you leave? What happened? What would help you right now? Because that can look a variety of different ways. I believe it was Lisa that mentioned on here not to force a victim to do anything. And I try to keep that in mind. I think early when you start doing this kind of work, the thought in your head is you just want to shake the person and say, well, you need to get out. He's going to kill you. You need to get out. With time, you learn that that's not effective, right? And it's not safe. So the question of what would help in this situation can be very powerful because you're giving the survivor the power to tell us what we can do to help you. Now, again, I have a job to do. I still have to hold the offender accountable. So it's a fine balance. It's a tough thing to balance. But I think when you start that way and you start communicating with the survivor, it gives the survivor the power back and it gives you a better idea of what you should be doing in this case. A big thing when you're in court is to build a story around the victim. So while it's so important to always be checking in with the victim, communicating, because this is truly the victim's life. It's the survivor's life who's being affected more than anyone else's. What we can't do is continually just put all the focus and all the burden on a survivor. So in court, you want to build a story around the survivor. Jim already mentioned some of this, but really looking at not only the testimony of the survivor, but the 911 calls, the pictures, if there are eyewitnesses to any portion of it, even if it's just someone who saw them fighting and arguing and didn't necessarily see the assault, if that person is willing to testify, bring them in, because what we want to do is paint this bigger picture. And that, even if it just a little bit takes it off of the burden, off of the survivor to tell their own story, is extremely helpful. A lot of the times under Michigan law, we're fortunate enough to be able to bring in prior domestic violence incidents, even if those are unreported, they don't need to be convictions, but that helps really paint a picture. And that's what we want to do, is paint this picture to support the victim's story of what happened, a narrative of what happened. I frequently ask questions. I'd like to essentially shift the blame onto us, make it very clear to an offender that we're the ones driving prosecution. I hate the question of whether or not the victim wants to prosecute. It is not ultimately up to them. I tell victims that. I said, with all due respect, I mean this in the best way possible. This isn't on you. It's not your decision. I make the decision on whether or not we're going to proceed with this case. Ultimately, the judge does, of course, but in this process, I'm the driving force, essentially, and our office is the driving force. I have used and will continue to use what we call victimless prosecution. If a victim doesn't feel safe or simply doesn't want to, for a variety of reasons, testify or continue the case, there are things we can use to continue the prosecution. I've had jury trials. The defendant's been found guilty with no testimony at all from the victim. We can't do that in every case. We shouldn't do that in every case, but especially high lethality cases and repeat cases, that is something we can do. Arianne mentioned forfeiture by wrongdoing. That's such an important thing that I think officers need to be trained on when it comes to gathering the evidence for it. Prosecutors need to be trained on using it. Quite frankly, there are legal avenues we can use to keep a case going for the protection of the victim and her children. It's extremely important to keep in touch with the victim. We had a victim, 18-year-old girl, pregnant, no resources whatsoever, completely relied on her abuser. This is a gentleman we've seen frequently. I remember him, unfortunately, by name. And she started out hanging up on our office. Anyone who would call her couldn't even get a few seconds in and she would hang up. We had to use a very different approach. We had to approach it from a standpoint of, and this is what I did. I'm going to be prosecuting this case as long as I can do so legally and ethically. I'd like your input as to what would help you in this situation. In keeping in touch with her, and that meant, and I don't expect every prosecutor to do this, but sometimes that means answering her phone calls after hours, weekends, texting back and forth, calling and checking in on her. It's been months and we're still in communication, and we've gone through the process of getting him convicted of strangulation, felony strangulation, without her testimony. We were able to get a year in jail, though he deserved much more for the safety risk he posed to the public. And all through this process, she has gone from not wanting anything to happen to him, not talking to us, to reaching out and calling us herself as soon as she feels threatened. He calls her from even though he's in custody, he calls her, threatens her, says he's going to send people to her house. She had his baby, threatens to have people come get the kid. So at the very least, now we know we're in communication with her, and I know that's going to keep her safe, that she can trust some of the officers that were involved in the case. She can trust to contact our office, and it makes all the difference in the world to have that trust. I'll try to wrap up with saying lack of trust is one of the scariest things, and we see that a lot with women survivors of different cultures and ethnicities. As I mentioned, unfortunately, there is a great lack of trust. So it's on us to earn that trust, to build that relationship, and to maintain that relationship. And finally, two things that are important in us all working together is collaboration and communication. Thank you, Arianne, for mentioning the importance of officer wellness and the effect that has truly on all the cases they investigate. Officers are much more likely to work with us and do the extra work these cases need if they're doing okay. That also involves probation agents, involves everybody that's in the process. So I want to thank everyone who does this work, and we appreciate your working with us. Thank you.
Yeah, that the self-care of the people who have to intervene in these cases is an important topic that we don't have as a separate topic, but maybe we can address it more thoroughly, because that vicarious trauma and sometimes very personal trauma is a huge issue. So James, thank you for mentioning, that batterers, men who engage in battery, are also human and are obviously wounded themselves. In fact, they may have, as you already suggested, may have witnessed domestic violence, have grown up with domestic violence in their own homes. And learned this behavior and for other issues. So for other reasons rather. So batterer intervention, how do we help batterers? What does it look like? And how effective is it? I'm thrilled to have Jeffrey Cape, who is one of the founders and board members of Battering Intervention Services of Michigan, to talk with us about this issue of battering intervention. Jeffrey, you available?
Yep.
Yay.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to have been chosen to be here today to share with you some of my knowledge. I run a battering intervention program in Oakland County, and I have worked with, at this point in my career, thousands of men who have been abusive to their partners. And I'm going to share with you some of the lessons that I have learned from them. But I want to start by making people aware that Michigan, since 1998, has had state standards for battering intervention programs. Unfortunately, they have not been mandated, and they're not necessarily monitored, which means that anybody could be doing a battering intervention program, not necessarily people who are following the state standards. And those standards were written in 1998. And fortunately, we've learned a lot since then. So those standards also need to be updated. So if people are looking for a place in which they can have an impact, being able to advocate for and get legislators to support the idea that these standards need to be updated and that there needs to be some consistency across the state, that is something that we can do. And also be aware that Michigan is one of the states that does not provide any kind of funding for battering intervention. There are other states around the country where the programs do get some state money, which means states get a say in what goes on in there, but it also means that the people who are doing the programming can have access to more kinds of training, supervisions, conferences, things that will keep them up to date on what is going on. So let's talk a little bit about what goes on inside of the room. One of the things that, so I need to say that I've always worked with people who were abusive to their partners. I just didn't start working with people who were abusive with their partners where I actually knew what I was doing until the early 90s. And at that time, I actually thought that I would have an always never list. Always do this because it won't be abusive. You know, never do this because it's always abusive. What the men in the program have taught me is that any behavior in the right context can be abusive. And the people who are best at telling you that are going to be the children, the victims. They're the ones who know. Please believe them. Don't just look at the behavior. Behaviors are neutral. Context is what makes all of the matter. There are different programs who sometimes take different philosophies, but there are certain things that need to be in there. One of them is what we call presumption of competence. Presumption of competence doesn't mean somebody will change. What it means is somebody has the capacity to change. And that means that programs need to give people the opportunity to be able to change their behaviors, but it cannot guarantee that. The other one to know is that abusive behavior, Jim talked about it a little bit, it's a learned behavior and it's a choice. So that's good news and bad news for men who come into programs like mine, which is that they can learn something else, they can make different choices. The bad news is that they learned what they learned, and these are the choices that they made, and that they were hurtful and harmful to people. And so underneath the behaviors are beliefs. Changing people's beliefs about anything, and you people are all politically oriented, so you're watching right now how hard it is just to change people's beliefs about something like a vaccine or a well-documented illness. So changing people's beliefs that are rooted in cultural behaviors that are supported in all kinds of minor and direct ways, indirect and direct ways, is very difficult, and it takes time. This is not something that will be taken care of in 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks. And so be cautious when people start offering really fast and quick solutions. The kinds of things that can be or should be being handled inside of programs is focusing on his behavior, what he did, what his motivation was for what he was doing. Not focusing on what she did that he thinks caused him to behave that. The beliefs that he got, where they came from, how they were supported, and how they influenced the particular tactics and strategies he chose to use. What are the patterns of behavior that he has in his life that manifested also in his abusive strategies? What does he need to change? We need to expand his understanding of what actually constitutes abusive behavior and reframe and increase his awareness of the impact of what he has done on the people that he cares about. One of the cautions I want people to understand is that currently, if you get a master's or a PhD in psychology, social worker, or practical licensed counselor, you are required to take 0 classes in domestic violence. They are offered and they can be something that somebody chooses to take, but please be cautious. People have those degrees. It does not mean that they have had any training or education in the field of domestic violence and how to work with people. And so oftentimes well-meaning people make mistakes that can be very costly to the victims and to their children. People often want to talk about whether or not programs are successful, and we have to be careful when we talk about that, because what is success? Are we talking about a reduction of criminal charges? Are we talking about whether somebody gets arrested again? Are we talking about a change in the pattern of behavior? Are we talking about the satisfaction and safety of the partners and the children? Depending on what you're looking for, that will determine whether or not you believe that the programs are successful. It is also important to understand that the research is showing that there is some significant change. They call it a modest documented change. And I'm going to break it down for you that there's been, people will report that there's an increase in respectful communication. There's a reduction in controlling behavior. There's a dramatic reduction in physical and sexual behavior and about half of the people reduced their emotional abusive things. Modest improvements in things like safe and positive parenting time, modest improvement in awareness of the impact on victims and children. Some reports are showing that there is a decrease in recidivism, and one of the latest studies show that people who complete programs are 3 times less likely to be rearrested. Now, here is my caution to you on this. Most abusive behavior is not arrestable. If any of you have an opportunity and go and look at the power and control wheel, most of the things, some of the things Nicole talked about, taking money out of your own account is not an arrestable offense. It is an abusive behavior, but it's not an arrestable offense. And so only using the criminal justice system is part of what makes it harder for survivors, and it makes it harder for men who want to make changes in their life. I could obviously talk for a long time on this. I have a lot of passion about it, but I'm going to stop. And if people want to talk to me, Teresa has, I think, made my information available. I'm happy to talk with people. I do want to make one plug for Washtenaw County. The Battering Intervention Services Coalition of Michigan is an organization that has an international reputation for providing some of the best battering intervention conferences in the world. And it started in Washtenaw County with David Garvin, who was at that time at Catholic Social Services, in a partnership with the shelter of First Step in Wayne County.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So valuable and hopeful. I don't know if Michael Brown is here. If he is, would somebody kindly elevate him to panelist? Our final formal piece is to talk with Nicole Beverly about how we prevent abuse in the first place, battering in the first place. Again, she's a victim herself of severe domestic violence and founder of the Enough Initiative, as well as the author of her memoir, Finding Nicole. She teaches young people, men, boys and girls, about domestic violence. If Michael's here, I wanted to say that Michael is the facilitator of Better Choices Domestic Violence Intervention Program, and he does a lot of work in nonviolent communications with school kids. So
Yeah, Michael is a host. So Michael is here. We're trying to get him to panelist now. He's here now. Let me try to work on that.
All right, great. Thank you so much. And Nicole, you want to take it away?
Yes, and I'm setting up my timer because I could talk forever about this.
Right.
I've got my timer going. So how do we prevent this epidemic? You know, any other epidemic in our country, we're preventative focused, right? With COVID, it's mask. With the flu, it's the flu shot. With STDs, it's education in high schools. Even sexual assault, there's education now in high schools. But there's no state mandated training or education opportunities for high school students or middle school students related to dating violence at this point in time. And it blows my mind that we're putting Band-Aids on the problem constantly. And I know everyone in the legal system, law enforcement officers, prosecutors are putting out fires and Band-Aids and trying to help these people. And it's rising. We're seeing an increase in domestic violence and homicide. So clearly what we're doing right now is not effective. It is not working. We are not seeing reduction in domestic violence. So what I have found, or what our organization has found and does, is get into high schools, upper middle schools, and now colleges also. And we teach prevention. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we do that. Just some facts for everyone going into this conversation. Nearly 1.5 million high school students experience physical abuse by a dating partner every single year in the United States. 1 in 3 high school students will experience dating violence. Young women ages 15 to 24 experience the highest rate of intimate partner violence, almost triple the national average. So the population being most affected is not being taught the red flags of dating violence, is not being even talked to about dating violence and what it looks like right now in our state, in our country, to be honest. Nearly half of all teens that have reported, that they've seen or know a victim of domestic violence in confidential surveys. 80% of girls who have experienced physical abuse stay with their partners and have no one to turn to. And often what we find after our presentations is we have lines of students waiting to talk afterwards because they will say, I had no idea I was in an abusive relationship until I heard you talk about the red flags, until you told your story. And I'm recognizing all of these things in my relationship that I had no idea were signs of abusive behavior because no one has ever talked to them about this before. So we do believe as an organization, and many people, that domestic violence is preventable. No one as a young person taught me the red flags. And I can only imagine, had I known the red flags when I got into my relationship with my ex-husband, I would have recognized them early enough on that I could have left that relationship. And I am very direct with students when we are doing our presentations that if you see these red flags, pay a close attention. The more red flags you see, get out of that relationship. And I, often wonder, had someone taught me, would I have ended up in the situation that I went through with, stalking, intimidation, and my ex actually trying to hire people to kill me from prison. And I don't believe I would have. So what we do is we go into schools and colleges. We've done a few college presentations, high schools, middle schools, and we teach students a general broad understanding of dating violence and abuse. We teach them the cycle of abuse so that they can kind of have a better understanding of how the cycle happens. There's the honeymoon period, there's the tension building, and then there's the violent episode, and then around again. We teach them the red flags, and we actually show videos of victims who have survived domestic violence and some who have not, and their experiences of how they missed the red flags early on in the relationships and what those extreme consequences were, so that they can really sink in and stay with these young people as they venture out into the world and are dating. It's really important because even if these students never end up in an abusive relationship themselves, they are going to be law enforcement officers, the nurses, the attorneys, the teachers, the parents who are someday going to be coming in contact with a domestic violence victim, whether it's a family member, a friend, or someone in the community that they're trying to help, or in, again, with law enforcement, how important it is, the interactions that they have. And we've talked about that. We also help break down the societal misconceptions of domestic violence, like we talked about earlier, the victim blaming and shaming, and that yes, men can be victims of domestic violence. Yes, this affects everyone, regardless of gender identification, sexuality. This is something that affects everyone in the community. We also enable students to reach out and provide support and help to other peers, family members. We increase help-seeking behavior and resilience building among students, and promote healthier approaches to dating, relationships, and conflicts, and teach students what to do if they see it happening in their community. We are going to be Lincoln High School right here, and where my children, one graduated and one attends now. They have been incredible. We do alternating every other year. We do presentations in the high school and then a large scale Purple Out event at the football game. This year it will be October 15th. So if anyone wants to come and see what a Purple Out event looks like after we've gotten into the school and done presentations, please join us at that football game. We'd love for you to see the work and how this can be really being done at every high school. And last thing I want to say about, we do pre and post survey data, and we show 92% effectiveness and change in our students recognizing red flags, knowing what to do if they see abuse happening, and knowing how to leave an abusive relationship after the presentation. And we're at Lincoln also in the process of training teachers and other willing staff members how to be safe people in our schools for teens that are recognizing these red flags after presentations to go to for help. And in our state, we've had some resistance from our coalition of domestic violence and sexual assault on education in high schools. And I just need to say that they did take a $500,000 grant by the CDC for prevention and chose to use that to plant 3 green spaces in 5 cities in our state, Kalamazoo, Detroit, and Houghton, Michigan, as our prevention measure for the state of Michigan, which they used some data that stated that cities with high alcohol density and predatory payday utilization rates were indicators for this being a successful thing in one apartment complex. So $500,000 that could have gone to actual prevention and teaching students in middle schools, high schools, and colleges went to planting trees and flowers. So I just wanted to point that out as a call of action too, that please, anyone who wants to contact them or other organizations that can provide funding for this work to be done, because we unfortunately can't do it for free right now. And I see questions coming up, but I'm going to hold because I know we'll have time after.
Thanks, Nicole. There's so much to talk about. And I just want to say, I am so impressed by all of your presentations. We had so much to cover, and I know we just have so much knowledge. So thank you so much. Michael, is Michael available to speak for a few minutes?
I sent him the link and waiting to see for him if he will.
Okay. All right, if he can get back in, we'll have Michael speak for a few minutes more about prevention. So I want to make sure, and I know all of our speakers do as well, that we want to leave here with every participant having some concrete action to do in order to help alleviate this problem, prevent, and then respond better to the problem. I'm not in chat. hang on, I'm going to try to get into chat. And if somebody, one of my helpers, Janet, if you can read some stuff from chat, that would be great. Let me see where we are. One thing, is James still here? Is Jim still here? Something that he said that I'd like to pick up on.
Yes, I am. Good.
Okay, good. Great. You had said in terms of when a batterer is arrested and in terms of how police respond at the scene, one of the phrases you put out that flew right by was they need to identify the predominant aggressor. And would you explain that further? And I know Lisa Larance has tremendous expertise in this area as well.
Teresa, Michael's here too. I just wanted to say Michael's here. He's panelist now too, when you guys are ready.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Do you want me to turn it over to Michael, or do you want me to go ahead and answer your question real quick?
Why don't we, hi Michael. It's good to see you. Why don't we ask Michael to go ahead and present for a few minutes, and then go back to the question about the dominant aggressor. Michael, can you talk to us a little bit about your work?
Thank you for inviting me and letting me be a part of this wonderful panel. I've been listening once I was able to finally get in. I don't know how much I have to add. I would like to share my own experience. As it relates to what I've heard, I have 3 very close friends who are dead because they were victims of domestic violence, one in a murder-suicide. The husband was a Vietnam veteran who suffered from PTSD. He killed his wife and then he killed himself. I have a daughter who's a single parent, and the children primarily support my son and myself in regards to a male in their life. I retired from working from the Department of Human Services in 2010, and I spent a lot of that time working in the Bureau of Juvenile Justice and in adoption foster care services as a trainer. And presently, I also work in Ypsilanti Community Middle School. I just share that background to indicate the framing of my own personal perception about where I fit in and what I try to do. Also work with the Dispute Resolution Center as a mediator in restorative practices, and recently in the past few years as a peacemaker. So when I enter into domestic violence services, I try to operate in a proactive and a humanistic manner. I perceive everybody that's involved as suffering in some kind of way, and I perceive everybody that's involved as participating in conflict resolution in some kind of way that's not necessarily the best. And most of my experience indicates that it's rooted in what we have learned. I like what Jeffrey was sharing earlier about how we make choices when we deal with challenging situations. And again, another experience to frame my perception about how I approach working with human beings. And that's how I like to look at it, which is why it's still called a domestic violence program rather than batterer's intervention. I work with people who make bad choices, not bad people. And then whether or not they are bad people, somebody else decides that. So I see my work as being part of a continuum of responses to try and create safety and order for everybody to be a part of a more productive society. I live in a community that had about 10 or 11 houses for the past 10 years. We've added about 40 houses that are still under construction. And the time, and I'm talking about like in a 2-block radius. And so it's kind of a metaphor for people and challenges. In that 2-block radius, there's about 40 or 50 more houses being constructed right now. And in the past 2 months, our basement has been flooded. Our internet is like off and on constantly, our concrete, our yards, everything, because of the increase of challenges that we have to deal with and the lack of order and how we go about dealing with those challenges. It's caused more difficulties and things to clean up and work on than I've experienced in the whole previous 10 years of living here. Now, it's funny because our neighbors started building a fence next to us, and we've had a fence. And so the location of the fence has led to a discussion, a disagreement, and a conflict that I perceive because of what I do. It's like it's something we need to talk about and reach an agreement on. And other people, it's like, we need to pull out the papers and we need to do all kinds of stuff and try and figure out who's wrong and who's right and who has to pay for this. And sometimes I recognize frequently that's the way things operate. Where I fit into the system and what we try to do in better choices is try and figure out how to make better choices so people are safe, so the children grow up in safety. I work in a school where kids know how to use TikTok, Instagram, and that kind of stuff. And the 7th and 8th grade, they can tell me how to get on all these different programs, and they get sent to my office oftentimes because they don't know how to write a 3-sentence essay, or because they can't do 3-digit addition and subtraction. So frequently when people come into the program and I recognize that I'm dealing with a human being that could be my son, my brother, my father, mother, or my daughter or wife, then it kind of changes how I approach that individual and how we're going to deal with the problem. And so Better Choices is rooted in trying to help people deal with problems. And it doesn't always work, but I think it's really made a difference in taking the basic concepts that we talk about as it relates to power and control and coercion and those kind of things, and helping somebody understand how they hurt other people and how they feel hurt as a person. And there's a better way to go about dealing with things as opposed to continuing the hurt and the pain that's being created by the choices that I make. And so I think it's been helpful. It helps in the schools, it helps in the program and I have a small program. So if we consider evidence-based practices and numbers and that kind of thing, then you look at a broad spectrum of numbers, it kind of looks like we're losing the battle. But when you look at the individuals that are participating and you see somebody who's able to benefit, have a better life, treat their family better. I encountered their partner in the grocery store or wherever, and their kids are. I have not worked in the school in Ypsilanti in the past 8 years since I started working there, where I didn't encounter a student who got sent to my office, who also have parents who were part of the domestic violence program. So it changes my perception about the work that I'm doing. It powerfully colors the perception I have about the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to save lives. And that's not always possible. And I understand that. But that's not the road. If I come into the program with the idea of doing anything but that, I find that my own biases and perceptions become things that cause me to feel defeated. The last thing I will add is one of the most powerful experiences, even after working for a long time and doing this, that I had personally was an internship that I did at Safe House when I'd gone back to school for a counseling program. And I did an internship at Safe House. And so I'm running the domestic violence program, working in the school, and I'm seeing people who are homeless, who get dropped off at our school, who wind up going back to their home being Safe House. And so all I see is the hurt and the suffering. And then I have to ask myself, what am I actually going to do about it on a day-to-day basis? What do I take with my power? How do I use the various tools and concepts that I have been educated to use? And how do I use that to help people have better lives? So that's where I fit into all of this. And I thank you again for allowing me to participate.
Michael, thank you so much. I think your experience and your work is, your work, you're demonstrating the need for a holistic approach and the very labor and heart intensive approach to prevention. It's a pervasive problem in the culture, and you see it, the symptoms in children in so many different ways. And so thank you for the work that you're doing and the holding of those kids in so many ways. We have a question. I do want to get back to Jim's comment about identifying the primary aggressor when calls are made. I also want, Nicole, we have a question about some of the red flags that you teach. So Jim, you want to do that? And then Lisa can jump in too, because she's got great expertise in this.
And I'm not sure if I said predominant aggressor or primary aggressor, but when we talk about a predominant aggressor, we're looking at the individual who poses the most serious risk or ongoing threat. So it may not be the one who initiated violence, right? So maybe my partner slapped me and she's 90 pounds and I'm a 215-pound man and I'm full of rage and I'm the one that poses it. When you leave this crime scene today, when you leave our home, who are you worried about that might be injured or hurt tonight? Who's going to live in terror, right? So we sometimes see women do assault men, sometimes fighting back. If I'm strangling you, 50% of our domestic violence homicides through strangulation show no signs. So the police may not see any injuries on her neck, but they may see injuries on me where she bit me or clawed me to get me off her. So sometimes when we don't have well-trained staff, the wrong person's arrested because of that. Sometimes we have wrong people just look at who started it. If she slapped him first, she goes to jail. What we're really advocating for is let's figure out how to keep people safe. Let's create some protection around the people who are the most terrorized. Jeffrey kind of talked about it earlier. Many of the things that are not illegal still leave families living in absolute terror. And I'll just put a plug in for this. Totally stupid off the thing. But last night I got a TV and I was watching Netflix. And there's a series called The Maid. And the first thing shows you an excellent example of what domestic violence can look like that may not even be arrestable, where there's no physical violence, but the victim is absolutely terrorized. She's scared to death. She now has PTSD. It's really simple, easy. You could watch it with your family and educate, each other on it. It's worth watching.
That's so interesting. I hadn't heard about The Maid on Netflix.
Yeah, it's just going to Maid. I accidentally found it. Netflix must know what I like. And I was shocked. I was like, that is a really good example. He punched a hole through the wall, sending her a message, you're next, right? I can terrorize you, intimidate you, have you live under horrific without ever assaulting you, because you know your next step. Just like we know when women leave, 75% of our domestic violence homicides happen after she's left or she's trying to leave. So we say, oh, she should just leave. She should get out of there. Well, maybe she's a little bit smarter than that and knows I need to stay here until I have a community that will support me and can surround me with protection. And we haven't done a great job at that yet.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, this program is dedicated to Courtney Neely and all other victims of domestic violence. And Courtney had left. She had sought help from the system and sought support. He was arrested and then released on his own recognizance, and a couple of months later killed her.
So if I can do a plug, I'm not sure if we're going to do this, but if we were to talk about a call to action again, it'd be us sitting down and writing letters to the prosecutor's office, to the chief of police, to the judges, right? We have orders of protection judges that get cases that maybe a victim's too scared to call the police, too scared to testify. We're not able to get a conviction, but through custody evaluation, through divorce court, through order of protection court, we find out this guy is extremely lethal or dangerous. Why aren't we sending him into interventions, right? Why aren't we saying, all right, we're going to hold him accountable without it always having to be criminal? That may not be the pathway in for every family to get help. And so we could really push judges to say, hey, take this seriously, intervene before people are killed. It's great we put our best prosecutors on our homicide cases, but wouldn't it be great if we put our best prosecutors and best judges on pre-homicide cases and eliminated that? And we could really, if my Pampered Chef group went and wrote my Tupperware group, my church or religious facilitation group got together and said, hey, let's spend 10 minutes and all write a letter to Judge Conlon. And what, as women, we want to see the judges do with these order of protection cases and take it seriously. We could send a message to our elected officials that we want change in our county, and it would happen.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And you had mentioned that earlier, previously. I want to make sure, I don't know if that's in chat, if somebody would be so kind of, not you guys, but Janet or Loretta, if you could put that in chat. But I think what I'd like to do is to, after the panel, you can all write to me about specific things that people need to do with addresses and even language, and then we can collate that and get it out so that we can maybe have some impact. Lisa, do you want to speak to this primary aggressor piece, because that's it's so fraught and difficult?
It is challenging, and I believe that James covered it very well, and there's such a range of expertise here. But again, I think that we need to get back to that idea and remember that we operate in a system that has a very clear victim-perpetrator binary, and we need to operate beyond that, where we are bringing complexity to how we think about people, talk about people, and address situations. And I have such admiration for law enforcement, but also we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. And women oftentimes present in a way that they are more likely to get arrested. Yes, they will slap first in many cases, but when this is much more than an incident-based physically violent problem. So looking at the full constellation of issues, as many people have brought up. Thank you so much.
That's great. That's so important. Maria, did you want to add?
I just want to give an example, because I think examples, yes, they're singular sometimes, but I think they can be powerful. Just to speak to what Lisa was talking about, case where a girl pulls up, she's going to visit her brother. She knows her abuser still lives around there, brings a tire iron with her. She goes in, talks to her brother, doesn't use the weapon, it's just there just in case. Goes back out to her car. Her abuser sees her, follows her to the car, goes on to assault her. She still doesn't use her weapon, but she's holding on to it. Well, it's interesting to be in court and have a defense attorney say, well, this case is going to get dismissed. And I don't do well with those kinds of starts to conversations. But let's just say it's amazing to me what that person, the attorney, presented was, well, it's obvious she came to the scene with an intent because she had the weapon with her. She knew she was going to possibly see him there, and she had an intent to at the very least scare him, if not assault him. And while I know what truly is behind it, and some judges may see what's behind it, it is extremely hard to explain to a jury, especially if they have not experienced domestic violence, if they don't understand it, if they haven't been educated on it, why this girl would come with a tire iron. So that kind of goes back to the whole idea of it's our job as prosecutors, in my opinion, to build a story around the victim, to make sure there's context that Jeffrey talked about. There's so much more to it. And we can use laws, we can use statutes, case law to present that. But really, it's so important that we have an educated community. Frequently, and I'm sure Arianne, has done this many times, we have one or two people in a jury. It's actually more frequent than you would think, who have either experienced domestic violence or has a family member who's been through it. And getting that person any way we can to speak about that is an important part of the case as well, to educate other jurors on the dynamics. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you, James, for highlighting all of that. It's so important we recognize the flags, the things that really tell the story of what truly is happening here, and not focus so much on the single or few physical actions of a given case.
Yes, and just to emphasize very quickly with that tire iron, we know in cases of heterosexual domestic violence where there's a history of her being coercively controlled, she's much more likely to use a weapon because she sees herself as equalizing. She needs something as backup to protect herself. And that is very difficult to convince others of that complicated dynamic.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. Nicole, do you want to mention some of the red flags that you teach about? Because everybody does need to know about these red flags.
I do. And I just want to put out 2 more calls to action. I've recently sat through multiple arraignments related to several of the victims we've been working with, and we've seen multiple offenders be released on cash bond. And I think it's very important that we that does not become the standard in our county, that we're seeing offenders being released with, on personal cognizance, with just without, and I witnessed it personally myself over the past 2 weeks, happen over and over and over again. That means these abusers are getting out within 12 hours sometimes. So victims don't even have an opportunity to go someplace safe and have a safe place to go. So please write prosecutor's office, judges as well on that, so that each is a case by case looked at specifically when those bond conditions, because many victims will be killed if they don't have time to reach a safe place. The other thing is sentencing guidelines in our state. Currently, domestic violence is a misdemeanor up until the 3rd charge of domestic violence. And what we're seeing happening over and over again is the 4th, 5th, 6th charge is being pled back down to a 2nd. So it's staying a misdemeanor in our state. So these abusers are never reaching federal penalties, federal sentencing guidelines, felony, sorry. And animal cruelty in our state is a felony and first offense. So I just want to point that out, that victims of domestic violence currently, and I love my dog, she's amazing, but my life is just as important as hers, I would like to think. So we need to have, in terms of our state and the people with the power to do something, these sentencing guidelines have to change. And I also, last change, personal protection orders. It should not be on the victim every year to have to file for a new personal protection order, go before they're putting themselves at risk every time they do that. The onus should be put on the abuser to file for the removal of a personal protection order, not the other way around. So those are my last calls to action. I mean, I've got 1,000 more, but contact me outside of this meeting for those. But just those I wanted to point out are huge issues that are going to continue to impact victims. So red flags. One of the first red flags, the most confusing red flags, is a rushed relationship. people putting on that mask, coming at you like they're the perfect individual. They're only focused on you. They want an exclusive relationship with you. They don't want you dating anyone else, talking to anyone else. But they seem like the perfect person. Gifts, we call it love bombing, buying you gifts, taking you on trips, all these things that seem like they should be good things, but it's a huge red flag if someone's rushing you into a relationship and doing this love bombing very early on. Name calling, put downs, which in the beginning are often used as jokes, like, oh, I was just kidding, I didn't really mean that. But in the meanwhile, they're actually breaking down your self-esteem because the victim begins to think, well, maybe that really is true. And then they stop being jokes and it just becomes name calling and put downs. Isolation and preventing you from seeing family and friends. They don't want you spending time with your friends. They don't want you because they're bad influences. They're not good for you. They're negative. Isolating you from your family. And the reason they're doing that is because they don't want you to have anyone to talk to or go to when you start to realize that, you know, this person is not a healthy individual to date. For our young people, this is a huge red flag right now, and it's using social media. It's tracking your location. There are so many apps now where young people are tracking their boyfriend or girlfriend and asking them why they're there for so long or where they're at. And that's a huge red flag. If someone's tracking your location and questioning where you're at and why you're somewhere, that's a huge problem and a huge red flag. If they're looking through your phone, you know, through your messages, if they're looking through your Instagram, through your Facebook Messenger, red flag. Jealousy, especially like if you have, you know, of friends or friends of different sexes, that's a red flag. Excessive calls and texts, messages to find out where you're at, what you're doing, threatening to commit suicide to keep you from breaking up with them, or self-harm. If someone is threatening you to do those things because you're going to leave them, that is a huge red flag. That's their way of making you feel guilty and holding on to you so you don't leave that relationship. And also everything's your fault in the relationship, blame, shame. And I'll leave it at that. There's many more, but those are some of the most, and especially with teenagers, what they can identify. So talk to your kids, everyone here with children, please. And you can go to our website. We have information on talking to teenagers about dating violence on the -enoughInitiative.com to give you some tips about how to talk to your teenagers about dating violence and prevention.
Great. That's great. Thank you for giving that URL. I want to make sure we're saving the chat because there's so much great stuff in here. So somebody please save the chat. Thank you. You guys, we're out of time. But boy, we have a ton of expertise. Thank you so much for all of your work, for all of your time today, for all you do. And I just want to say, take care of yourselves. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you guys also too for being a part of this. We appreciate your time. Just like Teresa said, this has been a very powerful discussion and some really wonderful suggestions in terms of what people can do if they are in this kind of situation. Yeah, again, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Mary, who just will talk to a little bit about next month, and then we'll be dismissed.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Mary, and I would just like to invite everyone to our November 6th presentation. Lavora Barnes, the chair of the Michigan Democratic Party, will be here to give us the strategy, the lay of the land, and also our action items. We are also working on making sure that we have the top 3 ladies of Michigan here with you. And so please join us next month, November 6th. Thanks, Loretta. Bye.
Awesome. All right, everybody, have a wonderful weekend. Stay blessed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you
Bye,
all in
everybody.
minutes.
Can we just say quickly to check our calendar, please? We're programming on the Facebook a little encounter around ranked choice voting because a lot of us have many questions we'd like to try to sort out.
Yeah.
And Teresa, we did tape this. This has been taped, so it has been recorded and the chats
great.
will be saved.
And the chat's
That's
also
saved.
saved in that. Okay,
That's
awesome, because there's a lot to harvest there. Thanks, you guys. Thanks for all your help. It was really touch and go there at the beginning. I don't
No,
know
you did a great job.
what- Thank you.
Really great, really great. Nice job.
Thanks.
Absolutely did a great job. Chris, we have another link, right, for the other meeting, right? There's another link for the other meeting.
Yeah,
Or
it's
did
like-
you just stay on this one?
It's getting a little late for people to do that, but I'll put this in the chat one more time.
All right, thank you.
Teresa, I just wanted to say thanks so much for having me. It was nice to see you all this week.
Arianne,
You
thank
too,
you.
Ariana.
Thanks
Good
for all.
job.
Oh, hey, thanks. See you later.
All
Be
right,
safe.
bye.
Wear a mask.
Yeah. Okay, so and Michael, thank you so much.
Yes, that was powerful.
Really, really.
Thank you
Beautiful.
for including me. I really appreciate being here and being a part of this. Thank you very much.
It's so obvious, the heart that you
Great
bring to it. So, thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, so thanks, Chris. So that's your registration. Okay, bye, guys. See you in a minute.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.